The Roman Empire wasn't forged in the clash of steel on a sprawling battlefield. It was born on the muddy banks of an insignificant river in northern Italy, in a single minute of dead silence. On January 10, 49 BC, Julius Caesar stared down the freezing waters of the Rubicon. It was the physical, lethal limit of the law. The rules of the Republic were non-negotiable. Crossing that border with an army meant death by treason. Behind him, 5,000 hardened men of the 13th Legion waited for the word. Caesar had 60 seconds to weigh 500 years of tradition against his own survival. And that was the moment everything changed. When the tip of his sandal broke the water's surface, it wasn't just a step. It was the instant collapse of the most complex political system of the ancient world. Rome's elite, entrenched in their ivory towers, thought they had finally cornered the most dangerous man alive. The Roman Senate was terrified. The colossal shadow of power, influence, and sheer military loyalty Caesar had amassed after years of ruthless campaigns in Gaul was just too much. So, they dropped the hammer. They issued an ultimatum that felt like a political checkmate. Caesar was to disband his army immediately. He was ordered to return to the capital not as a conquering hero, but as a regular citizen, completely stripped of his defenses. They had engineered what they believed was the perfect legal trap, a web with no way out. The logic was brutal. If Caesar bowed his head and obeyed, he'd be arrested, tried by his bitterest rivals, and politically annihilated. If he marched with his troops, he'd be instantly branded a traitor, hunted down across the entire reach of Rome. The senators, sitting comfortably in their togas, put blind faith in the invisible force of the law. They bet everything on the psychological taboo of treason. They were dead certain that reverence for the Constitution would act as an impenetrable shield. But there was one crucial detail these elites failed miserably to grasp. Caesar didn't look at the Roman Republic as some untouchable holy grail. To him, the system was just a highly obsolete, rotting political machine, full of structural flaws begging to be exploited. On that freezing night, he diagnosed his enemy's fatal illusion with terrifying clarity. The law is just dry ink on parchment, if there isn't a sword sharp enough to back it up. What was about to happen on the banks of that river wasn't a crime of passion or an act of military desperation. It was the execution of a flawless risk assessment, a maneuver so cold, so deliberate, that the Roman elite, drunk on their own arrogance, were too blind to see it coming. And before we dive deep into how this single choice brought down a centuries-old republic, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss our deep dives into history. And let us know in the comments down below. What city are you watching from right now? When we think of impenetrable defenses, our minds immediately go to colossal walls, massive stone fortresses, or entire armies lined up on the horizon, ready to spill blood. But Rome's most formidable defense wasn't made of brick or steel. It was made of an idea. And this is exactly where we need to put the Rubicon River under the microscope. If you visited that waterway in Caesar's time, you'd probably laugh out loud. The Rubicon was not some terrifying geographical barrier or a raging river that could drown entire regiments. In reality, it was basically a shallow ditch, a muddy creek that any Roman soldier carrying the full weight of his heavy armor could cross in a matter of seconds. From a purely military standpoint, crossing the Rubicon wasn't an epic feat. It was a walk in the park. But its true historical purpose was never to stop bodies. Its purpose was to stop unbridled ambition. It was a purely psychological roadblock, an ancient firewall, an imaginary line that carried the entire weight of the Roman world on its shoulders. For centuries on end, This sacred border separated the province of Cisalpine Gaul from Italian soil, the beating heart of the Republic. The law was crystal clear. It stated unequivocally that no general could maintain his military command south of that river. Crossing it with troops was a direct sacrilege against the gods and an act of high treason against the state. The Roman elite, blinded by their own hubris, had essentially outsourced their national security to a piece of paper. They anchored themselves to the naive belief that no man, no matter how powerful or influential, would have the sheer audacity to defy divine law and the Constitution all at once. To the Senate, the Rubicon was an invisible, insurmountable barrier. It was a taboo so deeply ingrained in the Roman psyche that the mere thought of violating it sounded like pure madness. But here's the million-dollar question. Is the weight of tradition really enough to stop a brilliant strategist who has absolutely nothing left to lose? Julius Caesar definitely didn't view the world through the foggy lenses of mysticism or reverential fear. While the old senators worshipped ancient rules and myths, Caesar dissected them with the cold precision of a veteran surgeon. He stared hard at that harmless creek and didn't see the impending wrath of the gods. He just saw running water, wet mud, and a massive collective illusion that desperately needed to be tested. He understood a fundamental truth about the mechanics of power, one of those bitter pills that old-school politicians still try to hide today. Authority that relies solely on blind respect for tradition is incredibly fragile. He knew exactly that the spell-protecting Rome relied entirely on no one having the guts to step up and break it in front of everyone. But there was a stroke of absolute genius in this tactical breakdown. Caesar realized, with terrifying lucidity, that the exact millisecond the law was disrespected, the instant his legionaries' boots crushed the southern bank and the sky didn't come crashing down on their heads, that colossal psychological barrier would turn to dust. The magic trick of obedience would vanish into thin air. He didn't need to conquer the insignificant geography of the place. He simply needed to shatter the collective belief that this Senate, which thought itself eternal, was actually untouchable. By exposing the system's massive vulnerability, Julius Caesar proved that institutions running purely on abstract fear are always one step away from collapsing. After all, what good is a heavy-duty security door if the lock is only made of imagination and ancient words? Destroying the psychological barrier of the Rubicon was a masterstroke in psychological warfare. But that shock alone doesn't explain how a general managed to convince thousands of citizens to march against their own homeland. Why would 5,000 veterans of Gaul agree to commit the highest crime in the book without a single murmur of hesitation? The answer doesn't lie in the purely magnetic charisma of a leader, but in a brutal financial distortion that had been rotting the roots of the legions for decades. Historically, the Roman soldier took up arms driven by civic duty, fighting for the unquestionable glory of Rome. The problem was, by the late Republic, that noble purpose had turned into a cruel joke for the men who actually bled on the front lines. The state had become an incredibly negligent and ungrateful boss. They paid miserable wages, delayed paychecks, and left their veterans to fend for themselves the second their scars kept them from holding a sword. And it was right inside this gigantic structural flaw that Julius Caesar planted his main lever of power, essentially privatizing the war machine. Far from the eyes of the capital and deeply immersed in the brutality of combat, he radically changed the flow of money and the very nature of military loyalty. Caesar didn't just command the 13th Legion. Through cold, calculated distribution of the spoils of war, he literally bought them. While the Senate wasted time debating laws in marble halls, Caesar strictly shared the gold of conquered tribes and looted silver with his grunts. He made sure every legionary wasn't just a disposable pawn, but a junior partner in a highly lucrative military enterprise. This constant injection of wealth created a devastating phenomenon. The center of gravity for loyalty was ripped straight from the hands of an abstract republic and transferred entirely to the very real, very tangible figure of the provider general. But there was an even more dangerous twist to this new power dynamic, something the entrenched elite could never wrap their heads around from up in their hilltop villas. Caesar built a profound existential dependency. The frontline soldier knew that the promise of a plot of land for a peaceful retirement and food for his family no longer depended on ignored resolutions back in the Senate. It depended exclusively on the man riding right in front of them. To these rough, battle-hardened men, the Republic had become nothing more than a deaf bureaucracy that demanded endless sacrifices without offering a shred of security. Caesar, on the other hand, was the very real guarantee of daily bread. He was the shiny gold clinking in their leather pouches. He was the leader who slept on the same freezing camp dirt as they did. The Senate bet all their chips on the illusion that patriotism would be an unbreakable brake against insurrection, totally ignoring the fact that misery eats away at any kind of idealism. So, when Caesar stood before the shallow waters of the Rubicon, the tense silence of his troops wasn't born of doubt or some sudden moral crisis. Those thousands of warriors didn't hesitate for a single millisecond. In the highly pragmatic mind of a legionary, the equation was mathematically simple and totally lethal. Across the river was a corrupt Senate that would throw them away like garbage. On this side was the patron who had pulled them out of poverty and promised them riches. The crime of treason completely lost its moral weight the exact moment the homeland refused to feed its own sons. They waded into the waters of illegality with firm steps, because they knew perfectly well that their survival didn't depend on a bunch of senators in fancy robes, but on the towering man paying them in cold, hard gold. The unwavering loyalty of the troops was the driving force behind this revolution. But Julius Caesar knew perfectly well that having a loyal army means absolutely nothing if you're welcomed as a tyrant, hated by the very people you're conquering. While the Senate operated behind closed doors in suffocating arrogance, isolated in their marble palaces and completely disconnected from the hunger ravaging the streets, Caesar was gearing up to execute the most lethal public relations campaign of the ancient world. The senators, drunk on their own status, made the rookie mistake of underestimating the power of the narrative. They genuinely believed that by declaring Caesar an enemy of the state, the public would automatically take up arms to defend the sacred Roman constitution. But they missed one glaring detail. The Constitution wasn't putting food on anyone's table, and it definitely wasn't forgiving the debts of a totally exhausted working class. Before taking on the imposing stance of an invading general, Caesar made a masterstroke on the political chessboard. He sold himself as the ultimate victim of the system. Long before his sandals even touched the murky water of the Rubicon, he had already sent his most eloquent allies, like the tribunes of the plebs, straight into the nervous heart of Rome. Their mission wasn't military, it was strictly narrative. They took to the soapboxes of the Forum to paint a devastating emotional picture. They broadcasted to anyone who would listen how Rome's greatest hero was being wronged, cornered, and humiliated by a corrupt elite, completely out of touch with the crushing reality of the little guy. Caesar wasn't marching to destroy the Republic. In his meticulously calculated propaganda, he was marching to save it from the clutches of the very men who had hijacked it to line their own pockets. And that's when the peak of his tactical genius truly shined. When the 13th Legion finally pushed into Italy, Caesar wiped away the standard rhetoric of a conqueror looking to force submission through brute strength and fear. Instead, he threw on the shining cape of a genuine liberator for the oppressed masses. What he did, brilliantly, was surgically hack into the pent-up resentment of the lower classes. For decades, the Roman plebs had been crushed by absurd taxes, predatory interest rates, and the arrogance of an aristocracy that treated average citizens like disposable pawns. Caesar channeled all that bottled-up rage and turned it into rocket fuel for his cause. He didn't ask the people to fight for him. The real genius was standing in the public square and claiming he was risking his own neck to fight for them. The reality check that hit the Senate over the following weeks was indescribably brutal. The Roman old guard had crunched the numbers on a theoretical equation that pointed to a long, bloody, drawn-out civil war, fought block by block, city by city. They bet big that the everyday, upstanding citizen would be the great wall of defense against the traitor who dared to desecrate the law of the land. The problem is, the law didn't mean a damn thing to people living without a future. The result of this public opinion engineering was a social collapse no politician in an ivory tower ever saw coming. As Caesar pushed down the peninsula at a breakneck pace, local garrisons didn't just refuse to fight, they defected to his side in droves. Cities didn't throw up barricades, they just blew their heavy gates wide open. Crowds packed the dirt roads to give a standing ovation to the man they saw as their true savior. The war was won in the minds of the people long before a single spear was thrown on the battlefield. With cities opening their gates and public opinion totally locked down, all that was left was to chop off the head of the snake, the Senate, in Rome. And this is where Caesar's military brilliance merges with pure psychological warfare, creating what we can only call a total paralysis of the enemy's algorithm. The Roman political elite, strategically led by Pompey, operated under an incredibly rigid military doctrine. They had planned a slow, pompous game of chess. In the minds of the senators, the Civil War was going to be a bureaucratic, measured process, involving endless months of diplomatic back and forth and the slow, majestic mobilization of legions loyal to the Republic. They calculated the traitor's response time based on traditional playbooks, firmly believing it would take him weeks just to consolidate his supply lines before he even dared head south. But the problem was, Caesar wasn't interested in playing chess. He just kicked the board and sent the pieces flying. The sheer speed of his march was the tactical weapon that imploded the capital from the inside out. Instead of waiting for the bulk of his army stationed up in Gaul, he made a call that bordered on total insanity by the standards of the time. He pushed forward with just one single legion, the 13th, made up of light infantry. They marched at a blistering pace, covering daily distances that Roman military academies considered physically impossible. They didn't pitch fortified camps, they didn't wait around for food convoys, and they didn't give Senate spies a chance to map their positions. The sheer brutality and aggression of this advance ripped Pompey's playbook to shreds and short-circuited the entire Roman command center. And that was the exact moment sheer panic took over. When messengers started galloping into Rome, horses foaming at the mouth, the reports weren't talking about an army getting ready on the northern borders. They were talking about an apex predator that already had its claws on the capital's throat. That speed totally annihilated the elite's ability to think straight. The Senate, which just the night before had been arrogantly debating how they were going to punish the rogue general, suddenly realized they didn't have enough troops in the city to defend it. The Rubicon firewall was down, and the virus was already in the heart of the mainframe. Pompey, the hero of so many wars, looked at the board and realized the math on the clock was irreversibly against him. The decision paralysis was absolute. What followed was one of the most humiliating episodes in the entire history of Rome. In a state of blind panic, the very same untouchable elite who dictated the rules of the world started fleeing the city in the dead of night. The massive traffic jam of carriages loaded down with riches and terrified senators blocking the Appian Way was rock-solid proof that their courage only existed in public speeches. The shock was so overwhelming that, in their pathetic rush to save their own skins, the magistrates made the most unforgivable strategic blunder of their lives. They left the national treasury behind. Tons of gold and silver sitting right in the city vaults, totally abandoned. Julius Caesar didn't have to mount a bloody siege. He didn't have to ram the gates or even draw a single sword inside the Capitol. The colossal republic simply collapsed under the weight of its own sluggishness, imploded by the sheer audacity of a man who understood that, in both war and politics, speed is the deadliest blade of all. With the capital paralyzed by the blitz of his advance and the enemy in a chaotic retreat, we need to look back at the exact moment this whole thing was sealed, to really get inside the mental gears of Julius Caesar. There's a phrase that echoes across millennia, repeated to death in history books, movies, documentaries, and even casual conversations by anyone trying to justify a tough life choice. Alea iacta est, or the die is cast. Pop culture has embraced these words as if they were the sigh of a desperate man leaving his fate to pure luck. Like a shaking gambler at the table, pushing all his chips to the center, closing his eyes, and praying the gods cut him a break. But when we look at the historical record and the cold, calculating mind of this general, we realize this romantic take is actually a massive misconception. What Caesar said on the bank of that river wasn't a surrender to chance. It was the formulation of a strategic point of no return, a ruthless mathematical calculation on the nature of power, loyalty, and human survival. Ancient sources, like the biographies by Plutarch and Suetonius, reveal a fascinating detail about this classic scene. Caesar probably originally said the phrase in Greek, quoting his favorite playwright, Menander. The deeper translation isn't passive, it's active. Let the dice fly high. He wasn't waiting on a specific roll from the gods. He was simply stating that, from that millisecond on, the chaos machine was officially powered up, and the old rules were out the window. By putting his foot in the murky waters of the Rubicon, he triggered a brutal psychological mechanism, widely known in modern military strategy as burning your own escape routes. By torching the invisible bridge of republican legality, he systematically eliminated any room for cowardice, not just for himself, but for the thousands of battle-hardened souls following him. The second the waters soaked the leather of their sandals, there was no more middle ground, no last-minute diplomatic handshake, no voluntary exile, no strategic retreat to beg for mercy at the feet of the Senate. And that completely flips what we know about controlling an army about to commit treason. When a commander leaves the door cracked open for his soldiers to back out, he makes room for hesitation. In the heat of an unprecedented crisis, the human mind instinctively looks for the safest, most comfortable way out. Caesar understood that to go up against the giant war machine the state could mobilize, he needed men fighting not just for cash or glory, but with the visceral desperation of cornered survivors. By crossing that sacred line, he turned the entire 13th Legion into direct accomplices in the highest crime in the strict Roman penal code. From that muddy bank onward, the life of every veteran soldier was worth exactly the same as their supreme generals. Absolutely nothing in the eyes of official law. They fused into a single, deadly organism, bulletproof against doubt. Because the alternative to total victory wasn't dishonor, jail time, or discharge, the non-negotiable alternative was the physical extinction of every single one of them. But there was an even darker detail weighing on the scales that night. To understand the real gravity of this risk equation, we have to look at the tangible, historical consequences of Roman politics. Rome was not, by a long shot, a civilization that let internal enemies off with a slap on the wrist. Caesar knew damn well what happened to people who challenged the arrogance of the aristocracy. He had the living example of the Gracchi brothers, reformist politicians who tried to help the people decades earlier and were beaten to death with clubs by the senators themselves right in the public square. He remembered the horrors of Sulla's proscriptions, the ruthless dictator who had thousands of political rivals beheaded, leaving their rotting heads on display in the center of town. If Caesar failed, if his gamble on speed was neutralized by Pompey's tactics and he got captured, his fate was already sealed by the bloodiest traditions of the Republic. He wouldn't get a fair trial in a well-lit courtroom. He'd be thrown into the stinking darkness of the Mamertine prison, strangled by executioners underground, and his naked body would be dragged by iron hooks through dusty streets until it was tossed like trash into the Tiber River. His severed head would definitely end up on a spike, showcased as a macabre trophy in the Roman Forum. His family would be ruined, his properties seized, and his name banned forever under the law of damned memory. So, what we're actually witnessing in that single minute of reflection is the physics of extremism executed to absolute perfection. Caesar forced himself and everyone around him to operate at max capacity for violence, genius, and speed. He created a claustrophobic scenario where failure literally became unthinkable. It's a bitter but realistic lesson on human behavior and power structures. True, unbreakable strength often doesn't come from calm inspiration or high ideals. It comes from intentionally locking every single exit door. When the paralyzing fear of death is replaced by the mathematical certainty of annihilation, if you lose, a human being is freed from all the moral, ethical, and institutional chains holding them back. Those comfortable senators never had to bet their own lives or the lives of their kids on a single roll of the dice. They operated nice and easy with a safety net made of ancient laws, blood alliances, and birthrights. Caesar, on the other hand, grabbed the knife and cut his own safety net on purpose, laughing in the face of institutional danger. He understood that the Republic had become so rigid, so rotten, and so dependent on blind reverence that a single dose of reality, applied with the colossal force of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose, would be enough to shatter it like glass. The alea iacta est equation proved, once and for all, that the most complex political and legal system of antiquity was pathetically incapable of handling an agent of chaos who didn't fear political death, simply because he had already accepted annihilation as a rule of the game. The most dangerous man in the world rewrote the source code of Western civilization, not with a speech, but in less than 60 seconds of a lethal walk through freezing water. The Roman Republic wasn't murdered by the bloody swords of a foreign invading army. It didn't crumble under the weight of a natural disaster. The truth, which is way more disturbing for anyone who studies power, is that it was systematically dismantled by one man who, operating with the precision of an architect of destruction, found the critical vulnerability in the system everyone blindly trusted. That tense, silent minute of reflection in front of the shallow waters of the Rubicon River was the ultimate proof that thousand-year-old institutions, no matter how rock-solid they look on parchment, can evaporate the exact second someone decides to test the limits of reality against the limits of the law. The old senators in Rome bet all their chips and the fate of millions of citizens on the venerable weight of tradition. They propped up the belief that reverence for the past would be a shield against human ambition. Julius Caesar, on the other hand, made a much darker, far more pragmatic bet. He bet on the non-negotiable weight of steel and the loyalty of men who had nothing left to lose. When he moved his sandal and broke the surface of that water, he wasn't just declaring a civil war. He was signing the death certificate of an era of political illusions and paving the way for mankind's destiny as an absolute empire. By the end of that first fateful day, against all odds, the cruel math of domination proved his brutal thesis right. It became crystal clear that the gears of history don't belong to the guys writing the rules in luxury marble rooms protected by bureaucracy. They belong to the ones with enough guts and audacity to rip those rules up in broad daylight. The Rubicon stopped being just a simple waterway. It transformed into mankind's most powerful metaphor, the point of no return, the place where bridges are burned and courage fuses with destiny. And it's with that harsh, realistic understanding that we wrap up today's journey, remembering that the foundations of the world are often only as strong as the minds of the men protecting them. If this deep dive into the guts of Roman politics helped you see the facts way beneath the surface, hit that like button on this video. Subscribe to the channel so we can keep unmasking the great myths that shaped mankind, and don't forget to sound off in the comments. What event from the past should we investigate next? Take care, and we'll see you next time we meet with real history.